We've had a chance to talk to a lot of elders, spiritual leaders, traditional knowledge holders, traditional food producers, all throughout North America, but also around the world. And we found that we all have something in common, that through the prophecies, the stories, the ceremonies that our ancestors passed down to us, they warned us about what would happen if we didn't take care of the natural world, if we didn't protect the things that give us life, for our sacred responsibilities and also for our future generations, so that they will have these same things. And they're all telling us also that they've been left to us the knowledge from the past of how to protect these things and how to survive the threat that we're under today. For example, how to work with the fish, how to work with the plants, how to work with the crops, how to work with the traditional seeds, so that we can survive this climate crisis. In our communities, we've been able to set up trade relationships through 2 international corn conferences and a lot of visits with other indigenous peoples that use corn, which is all the way from South America into southern Canada and out through the Pacific and the Caribbean. Those were routes that we traded before, since time immemorial. So corn spread from southern Mexico and Guatemala all the way up to southern Canada and down to South America. That we can revive those trade relationships and find indigenous peoples that have seeds that maybe were our seeds originally, that can grow in drought conditions, that can grow in conditions that can produce corn very quickly. And these are traditional seeds. These aren't modified seeds. My traditional chief, Anselmo Valencia, who was the spiritual leader and chief of our peoples, who's now passed on to the spirit world, told me about 30 years ago that we had traded corn seeds with the Hopi Indians, who live in the high desert where there's very little rainfall and no rivers or lakes. And they were growing this seed, which belonged to our nation originally, and they had returned those seeds, those corn seeds, to him for using now that we're seeing drought conditions come back to our territories. We also found farmers that had a kind of seed that grew from planting to maturity in only 40 days. And that's very important for indigenous peoples that are seeing very unstable weather conditions. Their growing seasons and growing length of time are threatened because of all the changes that we're seeing in the climate. So we need to talk to our elders, learn those ways again, bring back our traditional seeds that can withstand climate change, drought, and extreme weather conditions. Listen to the traditional stories and start to revive those ways and that knowledge that we're seeing exists in all of our communities. But a lot of times our young people, they all go to school now, they don't learn directly from our traditional food producers, their grandparents, like they used to. We need to find ways to revive those programs so that our elders are passing on that knowledge about survival skills, whether it's gathering, whether it's fishing, whether it's hunting, whether it's farming, and how to use what we traditionally were given to be able to adapt to what's coming. And this is life and death for our peoples, and we have to take that onto ourselves in our own hands. Whatever the United Nations and whatever the governments decide to do, we need to take that responsibility, and we have that knowledge within our own peoples and nations to survive what's coming.
I want to thank you for this invite to speak on personal responsibilities, duties, and obligations as a Dene person in affecting the responsibilities we have towards addressing, acknowledging climate change I feel that as individual citizens, we have certain rights and responsibilities that we undertake to live in accordance with the teachings of Mother Earth. Mother Earth is suffering at this time due to pollution, to changes in the weather patterns. I feel that she is asking for prayers. She is asking for vigilance and having our responsibility to observe. We cannot continue to engage in this pollution of the air and water, just Mother Earth, which results in the weather, the temperatures, the waters, the hurricanes, the tornadoes reacting in those forms. It's Mother Earth telling us we got to change our lifestyle, and that comes with us as individuals. And I feel that the Native Americans, Dene people, have a message to the world. If the world would only listen, that the indigenous people have a message to the world. And those of you who are listening to this, think of the responsibilities we have to keep Mother Earth clean, keep the water and the air clean, and not engage in any type of pollution and destruction.
The most specific examples that, as someone that goes out and does traditional food gathering, roots and berries, and salmon fishing, we've seen some real dramatic impacts into the salmon runs, dying off of fish because of high water temperatures, really impacting the fishery and how we take care of that first food that's a gift to us, as well as our roots and our berries. The gathering times have changed, the salmon runs have changed, and the time frames in which we can gather them have changed quite a bit as well. The roots and the berries are really impacted by the droughts and by the changing and weather patterns, and it's been dramatic in our gathering.
The specific changes we're seeing associated as a result of impacts from climate change include, I think priority would be the impacts to water, water resources, water quality. Again, water is the basis for, it's an integral component of the survival of all species, so I really think that water quality is probably one of the most important impacts occurring. The tribe has profound water resources located within the region. And we have spring-fed systems that are currently being utilized heavily to feed bigger city areas, metropolises. And so the pressure on these spring-fed systems, such that are associated with the Medicine Lake Highlands, which is a sacred site and located in Mount Shasta, Northern California, again, are not being documented. And so again, as climate change continues to occur, water is, I believe, one of the most important, if not the basis for human life and wildlife and watershed. And I see a lot of potential for a need to really look at water management strategies in the future.
The most significant changes I've noticed or hear people talking about is related to water quality and water quantity. And And so here on Navajo Nation, there's a lot of resource extraction. And so I've heard of sinkholes and things like that happening. But specifically with climate change, there's a difference in the amount of rainfall and the amount of snow. And this year we had a lot of rain, but we're in the middle of a drought. And so that's something that is the most concern for people, is the water and access to clean drinking water.
Some of the changes and impacts that we're seeing in terms of climate change in the Pacific Northwest include severe drought conditions, impact to salmon populations throughout the Columbia River Basin in the Pacific Northwest. We're seeing increase in fire, severe fire, catastrophic fire impacts in the Northwest. We're seeing impacts and changes in terms of plants and animal diversity and their migrations. We're seeing earlier plant growth in terms of their spring growth period. So we're seeing a huge impact, particularly in the Northwest. We're seeing increased ocean acidification, which is affecting all ocean life, particularly salmon populations. We're seeing storm surge and erosion of ocean and coastal areas. So we're seeing a lot of impacts, and indigenous people are directly affected by them.
I think that the United Nations could support the federally recognized tribes of the United States by helping them and empowering them with their inherent rights. The indigenous communities in the United States are familiar with their landscapes. We have traditional ecological knowledge that is beyond Western science. And if these nations were allowed to address their land without the obstacles created by the bureaucracies of the United States, they would be much more effective in addressing the health issues associated with the land. In particular, my community has traditional ecological knowledge associated with the hunting and gathering, and we are a buffalo culture historically. The buffalo have been removed from the Great Plains for about 150 years. But up until that time, about 80 million buffalo roamed this ecological area and defecated across these Great Plains, leaving a diversity of microbes that have a symbiotic relationship with the plant communities. It doesn't cost money for wildlife to exist, but it costs money to plant crops or other plants to sequester carbon, which is the cause of our global warming and climate change here on our planet. So if we were allowed to reestablish buffalo in these areas, we would greatly enhance the growth of vegetation and indigenous species, and in that respect heal the ecology that's been degraded from our economic practices in the United States. The carbon would then be sequestered and captured free of charge, and this would reverse climate change. So that's an example of the traditional ecological knowledge that indigenous communities could implement if not hindered by the obstacles created by the United States.
Well, I think it's been a proven fact that projects such as dams not only displace indigenous communities, but they destroy important landscapes and ecology. We have situations where corporations are allowed to come in and decimate the land and drive out indigenous communities that help that land continue to flourish and sustainable, trees which create oxygen, which we all need to survive. So there's a lot of things that countries and the United States could do, along with just basic reduce, reuse, recycle, and refuse.
The United Nations must establish an agreement with the countries that are parties to the United Nations climate change treaty, so that they reduce continuing atmospheric temperature rises above 1.5 degrees Celsius. We think it's very critical that we begin to stop the increase in greenhouse gas emissions immediately and schedule targets that countries throughout the world can meet, number one. And number two, the United States has to uphold their treaty obligations with tribes throughout the country to protect the environment and to be able to provide treaty-protected resources, access to our traditional fishing, hunting, gathering areas, as well as our lands and waters. So the United States has an obligation to also consult and work with tribal governments as they go into the United Nations Climate Change Summit in Paris.
Very simply, for the United Nations, I think for them is to just do what they said they were going to do. In 2007, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was passed. Implement that. Don't just say the words. Find ways to implement that. And if every country in the world has already signed on, hold them to those laws and help us to come back within the natural laws. And obviously, keep the oil and the gas in the ground. No more digging up of the things that naturally belong to the earth herself. No more commodifying the waters and selling them. No more telling us that the very air itself is for sale through carbon trading. Those carbon trading things kill us when we live under the refinery and they're doing a carbon trading with somebody in Australia and saying, okay, we're going to plant trees here, in 30 years they'll produce oxygen. So today at ConocoPhillips, then we can produce that much emissions, because that's going right into the lungs of my grandbabies, right into the lungs of my elders, right into the heart of our culture. Stop that.
I think that there needs to be a good relationship between all the governments and all the nations. It doesn't matter the size of them, whether you're one of the larger nations in this world or you're one of the smaller indigenous groups and indigenous nations in this world. There needs to be really some good dialogue as to what impacts those communities and what changes are going on that impact the environment. The environment has a lot to do with sustaining the people from a food source, from a health perspective, and I really think that there needs to be open dialogue so there's an understanding about all the decisions that are made and how they impact the communities, health-wise and food-wise.
Well, I think we need to observe. We need to listen to the elders, and we need to keep our traditional practices as much as possible. We've had to make changes through the years. We've had to adapt, and we were able to still provide our traditional ways and our foods. And we really need to teach our young people, teach our communities, how to do that, how to basically grow food, what to look for, what did our ancestors do, like keep elders' councils available that can recall and maybe even use some old media that's available. I mean, that's starting to come out now that they've had tapes that were filmed back in 1930s and 40s about different cultural things. Maybe we can look at that and see how to adapt.
I think traditional knowledge is quite important, especially because the main effects or the brunt of the force is on people that live close to the earth. And that's certainly true of indigenous peoples all around the world. And indigenous people that lived on particular pieces of land for thousands of years, they know the area and adapted to climate change in the past. So it's a repository of knowledge that should be looked into and used by governments, including the UN.